Snow lingered stubbornly on the high ridges, clinging to the granite like a memory that refused to fade. The wind came in thin, sharp ribbons, slicing across the narrow pass where an old wagon creaked to a halt. Elara Finch, 18, spellbound and wrapped in a torn shawl that had once belonged to her mother, stepped down into the pale gray morning. Her shoes were thin, her hands stiff, and in her arms she held only a small bundle of bread tied in cloth. The drifter barely glanced at her. His beard was matted with frost, his coat patched with mismatched leather. A man who drifted not by choice but because nowhere wanted him long. He had traded for her 3 days earlier, half a jug of whiskey and a rusted saddle no horse should ever wear. He had not spoken 10 full sentences to her. She was meant to scrub pans, patch canvas, do whatever tasks he tossed her way. She was not meant to speak unless asked to, but without warning, midway through the mountain pass, he jerked the reins, slowed the wagon, and shoved her off the side with all the disregard of someone discarding a broken tool. She stumbled to her knees, clutching the bundle to her chest. Breath punched out of her lungs. "Too much trouble," he muttered, flicking rain off his hat. "Storm's coming. You'll only slow me." She did not have time to answer. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding against frozen mud. Within moments, the drifter's silhouette dissolved into the swirling fog. Swallowed by the storm like a man snuffed out of the world, Elara remained kneeling in the cold road, the silence pressing down on her until even her heartbeat seemed too loud. Snowflakes drifted lazily, landing on her hair, on her trembling fingers. She had never felt so hollow, so utterly emptied of purpose. She had been sold, used, discarded, and now left to die on a mountain without a name. She rose unsteadily, wiping her face with a numb hand. The ridge road stretched ahead in a thin, twisting trail carved between sheer stone walls. She began to walk, half stumbling, half drifting forward, unsure whether she was following a path or simply obeying her last instinct, move or perish. Hours, perhaps only minutes, passed before she saw it. A single window glowing faintly through the fog. A cabin tucked against the slope, chimney smoking as though determined to defy the winter's malice. It was the only sign of life in this world of gray and ice, the only chance she had. She approached the cabin slowly, more afraid of hope than of cold. Her breath fogged the air in uneven bursts. Each step sank into snow crust that cracked under her weight. By the time she reached the door, her legs were shaking, her lips cracked and blue. She knocked lightly at first, then again when no sound came from within. She nearly turned away, convinced she had imagined the light, but then the latch shifted. The door opened only a fraction at first, revealing a tall man with a beard grown from solitude rather than neglect. His hair was dark, threaded with winter's early silver. His eyes gray as ash, and just as tired studied her without speaking. Cole Ashford was not a man who welcomed strangers. He had lived in this cabin for 4 years, alone with the memories of a life buried beneath the valley snow. Silence had become his language, grief his companion. When he saw the girl on his threshold, he did not see danger. He saw cold. He saw fear, and perhaps, against his will, he saw a shadow of someone he had once loved. Elara tried to speak, but only a faint rasp escaped her throat. He opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, voice rough from disuse. She stepped inside, blinking as warm firelight washed over her. The heat struck like a blow, painful after the frozen air outside. She swayed on her feet, dizzy. Cole caught her elbow not gently, but firmly enough to keep her upright. He guided her toward the hearth, where a pot simmered over glowing coals. She knelt by the fire, pressing her hands toward the warmth, wincing as sensation returned in tingling needles. Cole retrieved a wool blanket from a trunk and draped it around her shoulders. He said nothing more, moving with quiet purpose as he ladled hot water into a tin cup and added a pinch of crushed leaves. "Drink," he murmured. She obeyed, her fingers trembling against the warm tin. The taste was earthy, bitter, grounding. Only after several minutes did she lift her eyes to meet his. I was left," she whispered. Cole nodded once. "Storm will be heavy by nightfall. No one should be out there." His tone was matter-of-fact, but his expression held something gentler. He examined her cracked lips, the stiff fingers, the thin shawl. A girl abandoned, with nothing but a strip of cloth and the stubborn will to survive. The cabin itself bore the marks of a life interrupted. A woman's shawl folded with care over the back of a rocking chair. A pair of small boots tucked neatly inside the door. On the mantel, a faded ribbon tied around a wooden carving of a bird. Elara sensed instantly that she was stepping into a place that had known laughter once, and loss afterward. She glanced toward the window, expecting him to tell her she could warm herself and then go. People did not keep strangers. Not in this land, not in this era. Cole cleared his throat, rubbing a hand along his jaw. "You'll stay by the fire tonight. Storm will trap us both if it hits hard." It was not an invitation. It was a simple truth, spoken like a man unaccustomed to sharing space, yet unwilling to let a girl freeze on his doorstep. Elara exhaled shakily. Relief came in a small, fragile wave. For the first time in days, she was not running, not bargaining, not bracing for a blow. She was simply warm and Cole, standing at the hearth with snow melting in his beard, realized he had not seen another living soul in months, nor felt the faint stirring of responsibility, of purpose, since the day he buried his family beneath the dogwood tree. Two lives, both frozen in their own ways, had collided on a ridge road carved by fate, and neither would leave the cabin unchanged. Elara awoke to the soft crackle of a breathing fire and the scent of pine smoke threading through the air. Coffee torch, dark, familiar in a way that tugged at something deep inside her chest. For a brief moment she forgot where she was. She imagined herself back in her father's cabin before everything twisted and fell apart. But when she opened her eyes, the world she found was different. Cole Ashford's cabin was small, but every corner held a quiet history. Morning light filtered through the frost-streaked window, settling gently on objects that spoke louder than words ever could. A woman's braided shawl lay folded neatly over the rocking chair, the kind of careful folding only love could shape. A pair of tiny boots, worn at the toes, sat near the door, as though waiting for a child who would never return. And against the far wall stood an old cedar chest. Its brass lock was polished but untouched, like a sealed sorrow. Cole stood at the hearth, pouring two tin cups of coffee. He did not greet her with words. He seemed like a man who saved them for moments that needed them. But he nudged one of the cups toward her. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her body felt heavier now that the adrenaline of survival had faded. "Thank you," she whispered, voice still stiff with cold. Cole nodded once, then returned to stoking the fire. His movements were practiced, quiet, nearly ritualistic. Elara watched the way his eyes avoided the shawl on the rocking chair, the boots, the cedar chest. She saw the way his jaw tightened whenever the wind hit the door, almost as if he expected someone who would never return. She held the cup to warm her palms, letting the steam rise to her face. Moments passed where neither spoke. The silence was not oppressive. It was simply what lived here, the same way pine lived on the mountainside. When Cole finally stepped out to fetch more wood, Elara set herself to small tasks, unsure whether she was allowed to, but needing something to do. She swept away the thin film of dust near the doorway, folded the blanket she had slept under, and mended the torn thread on Cole's sleeve where it hung by the coat rack. She worked gently, afraid that if she moved too boldly she might disturb whatever delicate balance kept this place standing. When Cole boots thudding softly against the floorboards, he paused for a brief second. His eyes touched the swept doorway, the folded blanket, the mended sleeve. He said nothing, but something in his gaze softened like a man remembering he wasn't made of stone. "You don't owe me chores," he muttered. "I know," she replied, "but doing them keeps my hands from trembling." His expression shifted. He didn't pry. He didn't ask why her hands trembled. He didn't ask what led her to be abandoned on a ridge at the edge of winter. He simply nodded again, lifting the wood to the fireplace. Later, when she stepped outside to fetch snow melt water from the barrel, a gust of cold wind slammed the shutter, and she flinched violently, too violently. The bucket sloshed, her knee buckled. Cole, who had been splitting wood a few yards away, froze and turned toward her. "It's all right," he said softly, "just the shutter." She nodded, but her heart hammered against her ribs. In that moment, a memory stabbed through her mind bright as broken sunlight on glass. Her father's desperation, her stepmother's sharp voice, whispering numbers, negotiations, bargains, the drifter's hand on her arm, the smell of whiskey, her father looking away. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, tasting the shame like iron on her tongue. She heard again the way the drifter had yanked her forward, as if she were a transaction, not a girl. She felt again the bruising grip, the feeling of worthlessness that followed like a shadow. She blinked back into the cold air as Cole approached, slow and deliberate so he wouldn't startle her further. He didn't ask what haunted her. He didn't need to. He simply lifted the shutter and secured it with a leather strap. "You stay close to the fire," he said. "These woods aren't forgiving." A faint nod was all she could manage. Dinner that evening was simple boiled potatoes, salt, pork, and a slice of dried apple softened over the fire. Cole ate with the unhurried manner of someone used to long stretches of quiet. Elara, still wrestling with the shame of her past, forced herself to chew slowly, even though her stomach twisted with nerves. When night fell, Cole stepped outside, lantern in hand. Elara watched him through the frosted window as he stood on the porch, staring toward the distant valley below. She didn't know then that his wife and child were buried down there. She only sensed that something heavy lived in the man's chest, something shaped like a lost a deep to name dot in the dim light. She studied his silhouette, a man built by solitude, carrying a grief so old it had become part of his posture. He stood there for a long time, lantern flame flickering against the rising mist. His breath fogged the air in slow, steady clouds. Inside the cabin, the fire popped softly. Elara stood beside the window, her fingers brushing the braided shawl hanging from the rocking chair, feeling the weight of another woman's presence woven into the fabric. Cole eventually returned. Stepping quietly inside, "It'll get colder tonight," he murmured. "Best keep the fire high." He placed another log on the embers. The flames rose, casting long shadows across the rafter, shadows that seemed to breathe with the room. Elara sat near the hearth, hugging her knees. Something in the way Cole watched the fire told her he lived with ghosts, just as she did. Ghosts that sat in the rafters and whispered when the wind hit the eaves. Ghosts who made the silence heavy. Ghosts neither of them were ready to name. For the first time since she had been dragged into the drifter's wagon, Elara felt the stirrings of something she had thought lost. The understanding that broken people could still make space for each other, even if only cautiously. She sensed that Cole carried wounds as deep as her own, and perhaps even older. He glanced at her once more before settling into his chair. "You're safe here," he said, barely above a whisper. It wasn't a promise, it was simply a truth. He offered into the firelit air, and Elara believed him. The storm arrived long after sundown, rising from the mountains with a roar that rattled the windows of Cole's cabin. It wasn't just wind, it screamed across the ridges like something wounded and furious, tearing at the trees, shaking the chimney, forcing drifts of snow to slide down from the roof with dull, heavy thumps. Cole had seen storms like this before, the kind that erased trails, swallowed livestock, and kept even seasoned trappers indoors. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was because Elara slept only a few feet away, wrapped in a quilt that was too thin for a winter like this. Maybe it was because danger now had a name attached to it, her past. Whatever shape it carried, she stirred as another gust slammed against the cabin, making the lantern flame tremble. "That wind sounds angry," she whispered, half sitting up. "It is," Cole murmured, adjusting another log on the fire. "Best we stay put till morning." But the next sound that reached them wasn't wind. It was dull, muffled, and heavier snow shifting beneath weight. Not deer, not elk, something slower, measured. Human. Elara's breath hitched. "Cole, you hear that?" He lifted a hand, asking for silence. They both held still. The noise came again, crunching snow, too rhythmical to be an animal. Cole stood, pulling on his coat and boots. "Stay inside. Don't move from that chair." "But don't move," he repeated. Firmer this time, he stepped outside into the storm, bracing himself against the freezing wind that clawed at his face. The snow came diagonally, stinging like needles. But even under the furious sky, he saw them tracks, fresh, deep, circling the cabin in a wide loop. Someone had been walking close, watching Cole crouched, brushing loose snow aside. They were boot prints, large, and they hadn't been there an hour ago. He followed the trail several steps, until it blurred into white nothingness. Whoever it was, they'd pulled back before making their presence known. That made Cole's gut tighten. Men who hid their approach were never good men. When he came back inside, wind slamming the door behind him, Elara stood with her hands clasped together, trembling. "What did you see?" "Tracks. Animal." He shook his head slowly. "Boot prints. Fresh ones. Someone was out there, circling this place." The color drained from her face. She sank onto the nearest chair, as though her body simply gave up holding her upright. "He found me," she whispered. "I knew he would. I knew it was only time." Cole didn't ask who she meant. Her voice said enough. Fear makes its own introductions. By morning, the storm had thinned enough for Cole to check beyond the clearing. Snow still fell in a steady curtain, but visibility had improved. He took a lantern and walked toward the creek, following faint signs in the drifts. A few minutes out, he found it the remains of a campfire buried beneath a thin layer of fresh snow. Someone had built it recently, close enough to watch the cabin, far enough to vanish quickly. Cole's jaw clenched as he studied what little remained. The fire was small, the stones arranged in a way he recognized. Travelers did it when they wanted smoke to rise low and slow, a drifter's fire. The kind men lit when they hunted someone. When he returned, snow caking his coat, Elara already knew without him speaking. Her eyes, red-rimmed from sleeplessness, lifted toward him. "It's him," she said. "It has to be." Cole didn't confirm it, but she could see the truth in his silence. The storm grew worse throughout the day, fixing them inside like the world had shrunk to four walls in a single fire. Snow piled high against the door until Cole had to push it just to check the drifts. They were sealed in cabin, becoming both shelter and trap. Elara's hands shook each time the wind wailed, so he pulled out his old hunting knife, placing it gently in her palms. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she whispered. "You won't," he said. "This ain't for fightin'. This is so your hands stop Grip it. Feel the weight. It grounds you." She wrapped her fingers around the handle, closing her eyes as if the cold metal connected her to something steadier. "Like this. That's right." His voice softened. "Good girl." She held it tighter, shoulders easing, breath steadying. In the flicker of the firelight, something passed between them, not romantic, not yet, but a fragile trust, blooming from fear. Just before dusk, as the storm hit its peak, the pounding began. Thunderous fists hammered the cabin door, shaking the hinges, making the lantern sway on its hook. Elara froze. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. A man's voice cut through the storm, slurred by wind but unmistakably human. "Open up. I know she's in there. She belongs to me." Cole moved instantly, stepping between Elara and the door, blocking her from the intrusion. His shoulders were wide, silent, immovable. He didn't yell back. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood there, listening. The pounding grew wilder, uneven, fueled by rage or desperation. Then, as quickly as it came, it stopped. The footsteps outside staggered away, swallowed by wind and snow. Minutes stretched into hours. The storm screamed on. Elara didn't speak. Cole didn't move from his place in front of the door. Only when the wind softened, when the fire burned low, did he turn to her. She sat curled in the corner, arms around her knees, staring at nothing. He's gone for now, Cole murmured. He'll come back, she whispered. He always comes back. He knelt beside her, taking the lantern from the table, setting it close so its warmth touched her face. In the dim glow, her fear was raw, trembling. Young Cole reached out, resting one hand lightly on her shoulder, steady, warm, gentle, in a way that contrasted sharply with the violence outside. You listen to me, he said quietly, each word deliberate and certain. You're safe now, girl. Her eyes finally lifted to meet his, searching, fragile, hopeful. And in that small, shattering moment, she believed him. Maybe because he said it with the weight of a man who had lost too many people, maybe because she needed it like breath, maybe because the storm outside had forced them into a truth neither could ignore. Cole was a protector. He was someone worth protecting, and the world outside, the cabin, had just declared itself an enemy. The days that followed blurred into white. Snow pressed against the cabin walls so thickly that the windows glowed with a constant, pale light. The storm had slowed its rage, but not its grip. Drifts climbed past the sills, and the door had to be shouldered open even an inch. They were sealed into a world the size of Cole's cabin, two lonely bodies, breathing the same trapped air, sharing the same fire, the same silence. That was a silence that changed shape over time. At first, it was tense, frightened, watchful. Elara sat near the hearth with her knees tucked against her chest, listening for footsteps or voices or the crack of a branch outside. Cole moved around the room with measured steps, checking the rifle, trimming the lantern wicks, wiping away frost from the panes. But by the second day, the silence softened. It became something like refuge. Elara was the first to speak. Not all at once, never. She offered pieces, quiet as falling ash. I wasn't wanted, she murmured one afternoon while mending her torn shawl. My father traded me to a man twice his age because he said it was time I stopped being a burden. Cole didn't interrupt. He sat across the room and scraped the rust from a trap spring, his movements slow, patient. She waited for pity or outrage, but none came, only the steady rhythm of metal on metal. She continued. The man who bought me, he treated animals better than he treated me. Cole still said nothing. She looked up, expecting coldness, but found something else, something quiet and anchoring in the stillness of his face. His silence did not feel like distance. It felt like permission. She talked more in the days that followed. Not everything pain came out in careful shapes. As if too much would rip open wounds she wasn't ready to face. But she told him enough to lighten her shoulders, enough to let her breathe without flinching. And in return, she began noticing him. Cole didn't speak much, but she learned him through the things he touched. Every Sunday morning, without fail, he polished a set of old carpentry tool saws, chisels, a mallet worn smooth from use. His hands moved with a reverence that said these objects carried memory. One night, when she rose to warm her hands, she watched him pause before the rocking chair in the corner. He never stepped around it. Instead, he changed his path entirely, making a wide arc around the room rather than disturb its space. Whose was it? She asked softly. He looked at the chair for a long time before answering. My wife's. Elara nodded, whispering an apology, but he lifted a hand to stop her. You didn't know. She saw tenderness in him, then not obvious, not spoken, but in the way he carried his grief like a fragile piece of china. His voice was gravel, but his hands were gentle. The drifter's presence remained a shadow in the corners. Cole checked the traps he'd set near the barn whenever the wind relaxed. The rifle stayed loaded, resting on the mantel within arm's reach. A line of snowshoes leaned by the door, ready for quick pursuit if needed. Elara, too, began reclaiming herself in small but stubborn ways. Every morning, she braided her hair tightly. A ritual, she said, helped her feel human. She hung her mended shawl near the fire, with pride instead of shame. She helped with wood, with stirring stew, with brushing frost from the horses in the barn when Cole deemed it safe enough to go outside together. Sometimes, in the afternoons, they spoke of simple things, weather, mountains. But one evening, as the storm faded into a soft swirl of white outside, Elara found enough courage to ask the question she had held back for days. Cole, she said quietly, hands wrapped around a cup of steaming broth, why do you live out here, alone? He sat at the table, sharpening a skinning knife. His hands paused, the cabin filled with a stillness that felt differing, heavier, like a door opening that had stayed shut for years. It wasn't always just me, he said finally. She didn't breathe. My wife, Clara, she died birthing our daughter. His voice was steady, but underneath ran the rough edge of a wound that had never closed. The baby lived 3 days, long enough to open her eyes, long enough for me to think maybe she'd stay. Elara's eyes filled, but she didn't speak. She let him continue. Town was full of folks who meant well, but didn't know how to look at a man who lost everything in a week. He said, they brought food, they prayed, they told me God had a plan. He exhaled, the sound brittle, but I couldn't breathe there, couldn't sleep, couldn't listen to their voices. So you came here? She whispered. I ran here, he corrected. I wanted quiet, wanted nothing to hurt again. He set the knife down gently, smoothing a calloused thumb over the edge of the table. For a long time, the mountains felt like the only place that understood me. But winter's loud when you're alone, gets louder every year. Elara reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of touching his hand. Loneliness is a kind of storm too, she said. Cole lifted his eyes. Something in them had changed. Not softened, he was not a man made of soft things but opened, like wood splitting under slow heat, for the first time since she had arrived. He did not hide the grief in his face. And for the first time since she had fled her old life, she did not hide her fear. Two broken people, sitting under one roof, letting truth breathe between them. Outside. The snow continued falling in delicate sheets. Inside. The fire warmed the room, reaching into the dark corners, where grief and fear had lived. Untouched, Elara realized then that safety wasn't just about shutting danger out, it was about letting a person in, and Cole realized that talking about the past didn't betray the love he had lost. It honored it. They didn't touch, they didn't speak further. They just sat in the warm hush of the firelight, healing in the shared quiet. Two lonely people under one storm. Slowly, that the storm was no longer only outside. Winter did not loosen easily. By late season, the wind grew harsher, snapping dead branches from the pines and driving wolves down from the highest ridges. Their howls carried across the valley like voices of the old world, lonely, cold, hungry. Elara learned to distinguish their distance by sound alone. Cole taught her where the traps were buried beneath the snow, where she must never step after dusk, where the rifle cartridges were kept dry beneath the hearthstones. The days were longer now, but they carried a strange sharpness. The air felt brittle enough to break in one's hands. Even inside the cabin, a tension settled in the beams and rafters. Elara sensed it before Cole did. She often felt watched when she went to fetch kindling. Sometimes, standing at the window, she saw a dark shapeshift between the trees, too tall for deer, too still to be whined. Cole reassured her with a quiet, "Tell me if you see anything again." But the crease between his brows deepened each time she spoke of it. By the third evening of this uneasy peace, the wolves went silent. That was the first sign. The second arrived with violence. Elara was kneeling at the hearth, feeding a wedge of pine into the flames, when a sudden crack thundered through the cabin. She flinched hard as shards of glass scattered across the floor. A stone rolled to her feet, skittering against the planks. Cold air surged through the broken window, carrying the scent of wet earth and unwashed leather. A voice followed, harsh, familiar, slurred with fury. "Girl, come out, you hear me?" The drifter's howl knifed through the storm-quiet night. Elara's breath stuttered. Her body remembered everything: the wagon, the grabbing hands, the traded worth of a rusted saddle. But she was not that girl anymore. The fear was still there, but it no longer spelled helplessness. It sharpened her senses, made her move quickly. Cole's hand clamped gently on her shoulder. "Behind the cedar chest," he said, voice low and firm. She obeyed without question, ducking behind the heavy wooden chest where the wedding dress lay sealed in cedar-scented memory. From that hidden corner, she saw Cole move like a man stepping back into an old skin, a protector, a fighter, a mountain sentinel. Outside, feet trampled snow, more than one pair. 3 shadows. The drifter's voice rose louder. "You think you can keep what's mine? I traded for her fair." Cole's jaw hardened. "She's no man's property." He raised the rifle, stepped beside the broken window, and fired a warning shot into the sky. The gun's thunder echoed off the cliffs, shaking snow loose from the cabin roof. A moment of silence followed, then chaos. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. 2 shots. Then 3. Bullets splintered the doorframe, punched cracks into the stacked logs. Cole ducked, fired back through the darkness, his face lit in brief flashes by muzzle flare. Snow swirled in the window like ash shaken from a dying fire. Elara curled tighter behind the chest, but kept her eyes fixed on Cole's silhouette. Not with fear for herself, but for him. A cry outside. One of the drifter's accomplices had been hit or grazed. She couldn't tell, but footsteps retreated, crunching fast through the snow. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then a heavier tread pounded toward the cabin. The drifter no longer shouted, he screamed. A raw animal sound of entitlement and rage. He hurled himself at the door, shoulders slamming wood until the hinges groaned. Cole braced against it, boots digging into the floor, muscles straining beneath his shirt. "You can't keep her. She was bought. She's mine." Cole's voice tore back, rougher than she had ever heard it. "She belongs to no one, least of all you." A shot rang, point blank through the crack under the door. Cole staggered with a sharp inhalation. Elara lurched to rise, but he pressed a palm toward her, ordering her silently to stay hidden. The drifter shoved his way halfway in, wild eyes, tangled beard, fury glowing in the whites of his eyes. He lifted his pistol, screaming incoherent words. Cole didn't hesitate. He swung the butt of his rifle in a swift, brutal arc. The crack of bone was louder than the gunfire. The drifter collapsed sideways into the snow, unconscious, his pistol falling from limp fingers. For a moment, Cole stood over him, chest heaving, steam rising from his breath in the freezing air. Then he sagged against the doorway. Elara rushed forward, catching him under the arm just before he dropped to his knees. Blood trickled from a gash along his shoulder, deep but not mortal. "You're hit," she whispered. Voice breaking. "Just a graze," he muttered, though the tremor beneath his words betrayed pain. The other two men were gone, fleeing into the wild, abandoning their leader like cowards. Only their fading footsteps remained, swallowed quickly by the whispering snow. Inside the cabin, gunpowder hung in the air, sharp and metallic. Smoke drifted from the rifle. Broken glass glittered on the floor like frozen tears. Elara eased Cole onto the chair, her hands shaking as she tore fabric for bandages. He winced, but didn't pull away. He let her touch him, let her tend him, not out of weakness, but trust, a trust she had never been given, a trust he had not allowed in years. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the wound. Drops of blood darkened the cloth. Cole studied her face, seeing not fear but maturity, strength, fire. Somewhere between the storms and the shared silences, she had transformed. "You didn't hide like a frightened bird," he murmured. "I was frightened," she admitted, "but not broken." His eyes softened. "No, not broken." She pressed the bandage down gently. His breath caught at her touch, not in pain alone, but something quieter, deeper. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, a different storm eased. Elara felt her old self fading like smoke, leaving behind someone steadier, stronger, a woman who knew her worth, because someone had fought to prove she had it. Cole felt something too, something he hadn't felt since the days when a rocking chair still creaked in the mornings and laughter filled his cabin. A stirring of life, of purpose, of choosing connection instead of solitude. She met his gaze. He didn't look away. In the dim firelight, with ashes floating upward like tiny sparks carried on the wind, they understood something neither dared to speak. The fire between them had begun. Not wild, not reckless, but warm and real. Spring arrived slowly in the high country, as though unsure whether it was welcome. The snow melted in thin silver streams along the ridges, revealing the dark bones of the earth beneath. Birdsong returned in cautious notes. The wind lost its bite, carrying instead the clean scent of thawing pine and distant rain. Cole healed enough to move without wincing, though the bandage beneath his shirt reminded him of the night when all the shadows of his past had risen against him. Elara watched him closely, but without smothering concern. She had learned to trust his strength, just as he had learned to respect hers. When the thaw grew deep enough that the trail no longer threatened to swallow a horse whole, Cole saddled his old bay gelding. "We're going to town," he said simply. Elara paused with her hands over the hearthstones. "To report what happened?" she asked. "To set it right," he replied. He didn't tell her she must come. He didn't tell her she needed protection. He only looked at her with a steady, open gaze that asked if she wished to stand beside him in this reckoning. She nodded. Cole helped her onto the horse, settling her just ahead of the saddle horn. His heavy coat wrapped around her shoulders, warm and faintly smelling of cedar and smoke. When he mounted behind her, she felt the strength of him, quiet, dependable, a presence she no longer feared. The ride down the mountain was different from the one she'd taken months ago. Then, she had stumbled half-frozen through snowdrifts, praying for a light in the darkness. Now, the world opened gently, patches of green pushing through melting snow, waterfalls roaring from cliffsides, sunlight catching on thawed stones. Silence traveled with them, but it no longer felt brittle, it felt shared. Halfway down the trail, Cole spoke. "You sure you want to do this?" Elara lifted her chin. "I want the truth," said aloud. She answered, "And I want the past buried where it can't rise again." Cole nodded once, a brief but approving dip of his head. He urged the horse forward. The town lay in the valley like a scattering of small, hopes-weathered houses. A church steeple, a few shops with hitching posts sunk in mud. People paused when they saw Cole ride in. He rarely left the mountains, and when he did, he came with storms in his eyes. The sheriff, a broad man with a sunburnt face, listened as Cole recounted the attack. Elara spoke only when asked, voice steady but soft. The sheriff examined the bruise along Cole's shoulder where the bullet had grazed, then nodded slowly. "Self-defense," he declared. Clear as the morning, a weight slid off Elara's chest she hadn't realized she still carried. The sheriff studied her a moment longer than comfort allowed. Then he cleared his throat and offered, "There's a widow family by the church. They've room, if you need a place. Warm meals, safe roof." Elara felt Cole shift as though preparing to step back to let her choose the life she deserved, even if it meant losing her. But she answered before he could speak. "Thank you," she said gently, "but I already have a place." The sheriff looked between them, understanding dawning like a sunrise. "Well then," he said, settling his hat, "ride safe." They left the town the way they came, with fewer eyes watching but more hearts guessing. The ride home felt lighter. Birds circled above in widening arcs. A breeze tugged strands of Elara's hair free from her braid. The mountains, once cold and forbidding, now looked like vast arms reaching open. Cole rode beside her instead of behind. When the trail widened, he guided his horse close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. Neither spoke, yet the silence brimmed with something warm and steady. Halfway up the rise, Cole broke it. "You spoke with strength in there," he said. "I had yours to lean on," she replied. He glanced at her, beard lifting with a brief smile, the kind that showed itself like sunlight through clouds. "You had your own," he said, by the time the cabin came into view. The sky was tinged with the pink of late afternoon. Smoke still drifted from the chimney, the leftovers of the morning fire. The place looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because they had Elara dismounted first, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She looked at the cabin's door, the same door she had crossed trembling months before. She remembered the girl she had been, shivering, braced for rejection. And she remembered Cole's cautious kindness, how it had lit a spark of something she had not dared to name. She stepped inside ahead of him. The cabin's warmth embraced her. The rocking chair stood in its usual place, where Cole's late wife had once sat. It was polished, still sacred. Elara reached for the torn shawl she had kept folded among her few belongings, the same one she had worn when the drifter left her on the ridge road. She touched the frayed edges, then walked to the rocking chair. Softly, deliberately, she draped the shawl over its back. Cole paused in the doorway. "You sure?" he asked, voice low. Elara nodded. "It was a relic of where I came from," she said, "not where I'm going." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "This house isn't a grave anymore." Cole's breath thickened, not with sorrow, but with something gentler. He stepped inside fully and closed the door behind him, not out of habit, but with intention, sealing out the world as though making a quiet vow. For a moment, they simply stood together in the fading glow of day, the cabin shadows lengthening around them. The silence was no longer cold. It was full of possibilities of days to come, of wounds that could finally heal, of a life neither had expected to find. Elara realized then that survival was only the beginning. She had begun again, rooted in strength, shaped by the mountains, held by the presence of a man who saw not a rescued girl, but a life worth standing beside. And Cole realized something too, something he had carried behind his ribs since the night he found her on the ridge road. Love and protection were not betrayals of the dead, they were gifts to the living. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, a new future began.